is the 12-team playoff. This is the bracket. And, of course, the first-round games on home field advantage for Texas, Ohio State, and Columbus, Penn State. And then also the Fighting Irish against another school out of Indiana. Indiana, the Hoosiers, will play in South Bend. The top 4 seeds, Oregon, Georgia, Boise State, and Arizona State. There are a couple of surprises. There was the drama about what Alabama would get in, would SMU get in if they lost, and it had ended up being pretty much cut and dried by the end of the weekend.
Yeah, look, they got it as right as I think they could. I mean, I was impressed with the committee and what they did by really looking like the eye test was actually used, and certain things mattered this year where they didn't before. And really the only whiny gripe you got was from the SEC on the fact that the losses to SEC teams couldn't count, and some kind of bogus narrative about, well, we shouldn't schedule hard non-conference games when that had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to see that it all worked out for the most part for, I think, a lot of deserving teams, and that it didn't become a situation where you had a good chunk of the country or portion of the country that felt like this was some biased exercise that was already determined preseason, like a lot of people kind of thought throughout the process of giving these seeds and the update shows throughout the past few weeks. There's been this big fear, this concern, this crisis for some, this scandal, if you will, maybe for some people, that, you know, the two major leagues kind of run the show and they're going to get their way. And I don't think they got their way here because of the way mostly the games shook out this weekend. Now, had the games been different, then I think we see Alabama in this field, right? But the fact that Clemson pulled an upset, able to shake some things up, and I just really, more than anything else, I really had one thought in looking at this bracket, or two thoughts. My first thought was, I think it's beautiful. I think it's awesome. I think it's going to be a lot of fun when this gets all started up. I'm glad that we're finally at this point, although I'm going to miss the regular season chock full of games nearly every day of the week. But this looks incredible. And I guess the only tweak that I kind of wished we would have seen would be SMU going to Texas, much like they have Indiana going to Notre Dame. I just think that would have been incredible to see the Ponies go down to Austin and have a little all-Texas matchup. But the seeds are the seeds, and, you know, for all the hand-wringing and concern about the Big 12, and they're not going to, you know, get any respect and this and that, Arizona State does end up with a first-round bye. So that worked itself out. A lot of this worked itself out like I kind of thought that it would, and I'm just kind of thrilled to be in this position where we're actually looking at the real deal bracket, and I'm excited to see kind of how it all unfolds.
Are there any bangers? Are any bangers in the first round? Absolutely. You have Clemson, who was not quite who they've been, but they had the huge win against SMU where they had the big lead, and then they kick a 56-yard field goal at the buzzer, which affected who got in. It got in because they got in because of it. SMU almost dropped out. They didn't, but it knocked Alabama out. And then, of course, Tennessee, Ohio State, banger. With all due respect, SMU is up and coming with what they've done. They're in, but not a banger, but still an interesting matchup. And then Indiana, Notre Dame there, a team, again, another up-and-coming program in Indiana. But the second round, you might have a couple of three bangers, too.
I'll tell you what, Indiana, I mean, Penn State got the best draw, I guess, technically, although – you know, I have no faith in James Franklin to win two big games in a row. But you know, because I don't think it's about the talent. I think it's about the moment for him. But Indiana, who nobody had a strength of schedule discussion about, and they're 11-1 playing the schedule that they played in a power conference, so they should be in. I have no problem with them being in. I just find it funny that, you know, the SEC was kind of like, oh, well, SMU shouldn't be. Like, okay, buddy, like that's not really who you should be mad at. And then their fans get a nice little reward of not having a home game, but only having to drive a little ways to go see a playoff game. So that's interesting. I love the storylines that baked into Clemson and Texas. You know, Sark and Dabo squared off when Sark was at Alabama and Dabo's at Clemson, and you've got Ewers versus Klubnik, which is a rematch of some 2020 Texas high school football. The Dodge Bowl, there's Andrew McCuba, who plays for Texas now, who was at Clemson. I think that one's great, and I absolutely love Tennessee and Ohio State. I would love to see a game like this every year, and if Ryan Day loses this game at home to Tennessee, 2025 is going to be a very long year for him.
You could have an immediate Oregon-Ohio State rematch in round 2 if Ohio State takes care of their business against the Vols. Craig?
Yeah, when you have a vast field like this, I mean, rematches are going to be almost inevitable, especially when you have multiple teams from a couple of different conferences. I mean, they're just going to run into each other, barring some very low percentage chance that doesn't occur. But, yeah, I think Tennessee, Ohio State's obviously the biggest game in the first round. It's not even particularly close, although Clemson, Texas will be pretty massive in its own right. I just think as far as like everything that it entails, I think Tennessee, Ohio State's clearly the big game, but Clemson, Texas is right there. And yes, we're going to get our full meal deal of, did you know Cade Klubnik's from Austin?
Yeah.
I mean, get ready to hear that about a billion times over the next couple of weeks. So that's cool. But like, would y'all not have preferred SMU, Texas?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I would rather have preferred that. I also
and it was only one spot, so it wasn't like you had to like really rig this thing up. I know you go by your seeds and everything, but like, you have Clemson behind the team they just beat.
Yeah.
You have Clemson behind SMU.
Yeah,
you
just beat.
You literally just beat them.
Beating somebody doesn't always matter, right? But I get what you're saying.
You beat them the night before. You beat them the night before the unveilings, and you're a spot behind them. Like, that doesn't make that. Like, my big gripe is that right there is that you could have just flipped those two. It makes sense since Clemson just beat them literally less than 24 hours before that in an incredible game. And then you get your Indiana, Notre Dame. And then you get SMU, Texas, which I just think is not something that, is we've ever really seen. So, yeah, that would have been really, really cool. But Clemson, Texas will be awesome. And, yes, we'll get our fill of Cade Klubnik and Andrew McCuba and all the other crossovers. SMU, Penn State ought to be a hell of a game. I think the Ponies proved a lot to a lot of people this past weekend. And I think Indiana, Notre Dame, I don't think you want to, like, start out, even though I'm talking about SMU, Texas, like making these regional on purpose. Excuse me. But I think if you have the chance to, then, hey, why not? So Indiana, Notre Dame falling into their laps like that, I think is awesome. And having a little bit of regionality is pretty cool. I don't think you need to ensure that every time, but I think that especially if you're Notre Dame or Indiana and you're going to possibly go to the national championship game, and it's kind of nice to have a game that's closer to home if you're an Indiana fan that you could travel to, and it's not like you're going 4 different places all over the country. So I like that draw for them a lot, and I like the regionality in that part of the bracket. Again, can't do that across the board because that just wouldn't make sense with the seeding, but I do think you could have flipped Clemson and SMU, and this would have been perfect, in my opinion. It would have been just about perfect, but it's still going to be a lot of fun.
Am I right here that in 1982, wasn't that the year that they were undefeated? And they, I think, beat Pittsburgh in the Cotton Bowl, but Penn State won the national title.
Don't give me the line.
I'm just saying. So there is some history, not so much to that series, but between those two programs back in, I believe it was in 1982.
Yeah, I do think, though, that you're going to see, and this is going to be the next big battle in this, outside of, whatever, hell hath Greg Sankey wrought here because he, didn't get his way, kinda, with this playoff is you are asking, okay, let's just, I'm going to use Clemson as an example. If Clemson beats Texas, okay, they get, you're going to ask their fans to go to Austin, Texas. Then you're going to ask.
Not hard to ask them to do that. They'll be more than fired up, I'm sure. But I know where you're going here.
But then you're going to ask them to go to Atlanta, which is close. Okay, so that's fine. Okay, that's a little bit of a reward. Then you're asking them to go on the road again if they continue to win, and then again after they were just in Charlotte as well. So you're talking Charlotte, Austin, Atlanta, road to Vegas, like road game, and then another one to Vegas. That is not sustainable and makes no sense. And the NFL, which has all the money in the world, doesn't go neutral sites in their playoffs. This will eventually
until the Super Bowl.
Until the Super Bowl, which makes sense for this too. Like, go have a neutral site for the national championship game. But this is where the bowl games, the way that we know them, will be changed because this is not sustainable, and it's not going to be good to have teams that you're asking fans to potentially take 5 road trips in a row.
Yeah, I remember when the 4-team playoff started, and I remember a former Texas player who was talking back then about how the committee, and I don't know how right he was on this ultimately. He seemed to know a lot about a lot of things, and I don't know if they were always accurate or not, but this guy knew a lot of people, and I remember him telling us back in whatever that was, 2014, that the committee at that time, only having to choose 4, was going to prefer the big brands, which wasn't anything surprising. But one of the things that he said that was kind of eyebrow-raising was part of the reason as to why a Baylor would get, pushed to the side for a Georgia, or a TCU even for that matter, would get pushed aside for an Alabama, would be the crowds. The crowds they bring to those games, that the bowl games themselves would want the bigger teams with the bigger crowds, right? I remember we were in New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl, and they were talking about how it was kind of dead compared to the year prior, where the year prior was like Texas and somebody, it was like twice as many people. And so those bowls want the biggest matchups possible, right? And so I think if that was an argument back then of just traveling for one game, yeah, now imagine having, hey, Boise State fans, I know the odds are low, but let's just say you'll probably empty your savings to go in this one-time journey of traveling to these 3 or 4 locations. But even the biggest of donors are going to be like, damn, man, like you got to jet hop across like the entire 6 weeks, 4 different locations, or potentially 4 different locations. That is asking a lot of anybody. That's asking for a lot of travel, a lot of ticket money, and a lot of that. So it is going to be curious to see by the end kind of what the crowds look like.
And sometimes you don't know until about a week or so before that you're going to go to Miami, or you're going to go to Atlanta, or wherever. All right, round 2. Because of the conference championship setup, you have Arizona State, who was ranked just outside the top 10, or number 10, after their dominant win against Iowa State, which we'll get much more into the Big 12 and what happened this year, along with Arizona State beating Iowa State. You have them at 4, and they're going to take on 5 Texas. That's the way the bracket should be set up. Boise State will get
or Clemson
numbers, or Clemson. Boise State will get Penn State or SMU. Does including the conference champions with a first-round bye set up enough bangers in round 2?
I mean, it doesn't need to be about that. I mean, they're bangers because they're conference champions. I do kind of agree with you should maybe just seed the 4 seeds as the top 4 seeds, and the conference championship just guarantees that you're in.
Because I don't want to be like the bowl games that want Alabama, Georgia, or Ohio State, Texas. Because if you earn a 4 seed, you get a 4 seed, you get a bye, then you get to host somebody. Yeah. Or not host somebody, but you get a chance to play one round in already.
Yeah, and I get the bye is really important, when you're talking about attrition and getting healthy and, getting a chance to really look at both opponents in a way that the team you're playing will not. All of that is very important. I just think that, if it should be the top 4 seeds that get the byes. But also with the home games and all that, this is a bit of a complex system. But look, I agree with the way they did that, ranking the 5 conference champions of, Oregon, Georgia, Boise State, and Arizona State. I think that was fair. And Clemson, obviously, is the 5th one.
Yeah, I think with Clemson winning, this worked out the way it was supposed to, but I know some people will probably hate this. I think you should probably go to 16 at this point, and the reason or reduce to 8. But my point being, no first-round buys. No first-round buys, in my opinion. I think that's such a huge advantage. Or if you're going to do that, yeah, I do think you get rid of the seeding as far as the 4 conference champions are automatically on the top. Would y'all agree with that?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think Arizona State should be the 4 seed, or Boise State should be the what are they, the 3 seed? I don't think that should just be automatic because they won their conference. I think if Arizona State won the Big 12, but you feel like they're the 9th team, they should be the 9th team. They get in because they're the Big 12 team, right? They're the highest rated conference champion, but they don't necessarily deserve a top 4 spot. They deserve a spot, but not an automatic bye top 4 spot.
I don't know why.
And I say this for anybody.
I see what you're saying, but there's got to be a reason why that may not work, because otherwise you would have had in the first round Oregon, Georgia, Texas, and what? Ohio State?
Texas wouldn't have been a top 4.
You don't think so? Oh,
not
absolutely.
After they're lost.
Oh, I think the only reason
they're not top 4 now.
No, no, they're not top 4 now
champs.
because Boise State and Arizona State get a top.
Yeah.
So I think Texas would have, no matter losing to Georgia or not, they could have lost the game and remained a team that's got a first-round bye. So that's the only thing against that is that there could be scenarios, but there's going to be scenarios against or with or positive or negative for various different angles.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wasn't thinking about them dropping out of the 4 because of the Big 12 champ just automatically being seated above, or Boise State for that matter. So, yeah, in the latest AP, so that would have been Oregon, Georgia, Notre Dame, Texas. Those would have been your 4 teams. I don't like the first round bye. I just think that's such a massive advantage for those 4 teams. I also don't love the idea of 16 either, so I'm probably putting myself stuck in a situation here because you're right. But I wouldn't mind seeing those because I think that also eliminates the argument of, yeah, we got a first-round bye, but we never get to host a playoff game, which is going to be inevitably a conversation as well and kind of already has been. So that's something I wouldn't mind seeing changed necessarily.
Okay.
But
I'll just throw this out there. Texas gets to host a playoff game. Georgia beat them twice, and they don't get to. And the other thing is they're going to see it on TV, and they're going to see that like the vibes of a playoff game. And I've said this from the very beginning. Michigan and Ohio State is going to be maybe the best example of this because they hate each other so much. But if Ohio State gets the bye, Michigan gets to host the playoff game, Ohio State's going to be like, well, we kind of want that too. So that's where the rubber is going to meet the road here on the bowl thing. I think because they're going to say, look, 1, financially not the best thing. 2, everybody's going to want at least through the first couple rounds where everybody gets to have a home game.
This comes from Mike Games, who's a huge fan of Ohio. He was out for a while, for a long time. He's back in the chat room. Your takes on travel is dumb. Go back to 2016 when Youngstown State had to travel a lot during a playoff run. FCS schools can travel those miles, but FBS schools can't. Youngstown State in 2016, I believe, played 2 or 3 games at home, and then, of course, the championship game was in Frisco. They played against Watford at home, and they also played against Samford at home. And if you were to play at Mary Hardin Baylor, for example, in Belton, which is a Division III team, in Youngstown and all those schools, Whitewater, Mount Union, how many people are going to be at that game? Like 5,000 or so? Maybe? Yeah. I don't know. We're looking at, when you're talking about the games going to be played in these larger stadiums, you're talking about what could be, even though allotment to have a lot to do with it, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of fans going.
All due respect, Mike, your take is dumb because of math. 1, you're asking Texas to help fill up their own stadium, which they'll do, then to go fill up the Peach Bowl with Arizona State, then to go fill up another one, and then to go fill up another one and go fill up another one. This is not Youngstown State hopping around to FCS venues. Yeah. That's a different thing, and only having to do it twice. And believe me, if they could have it any other way, they would, but this is their big athletic expenditure. And you're also asking the fans to commit a lot more money, and you've got the NIL thing out there too, right? You want the NIL to be a big deal. So you can't just say like, okay, we want you to go out of these games, but also please make sure our players get paid.
Mike, you said they had to travel 2,500 miles to Eastern Washington. Yeah, you're going to have to travel a lot. That's fine. But say that the FCS teams can do it, the amount of fans to travel compared to others. We're not going to get off center of what we're going to do here with this 12-team bracket. Who got the best draw?
Penn State.
As far as the first-round teams go.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Texas got a pretty good draw.
Yeah.
Texas, I think has to feel really good about their chances against Clemson. I think they'd feel great about their chances against Arizona State on a neutral site. And then, Tennessee, Ohio State, or Oregon. Obviously, it'll get into the semifinals, and you'll have a pretty elite set of 4 teams there. But I think those first 2-round games are manageable for UT. I think, obviously, Tennessee and Ohio State, they're kind of starting off right out of the chutes with a pretty tough game. Notre Dame, if they didn't have to turn around and then go play Georgia potentially, the Indiana game, that's a really interesting one. On paper, you just eye test that and you go like, oh, well, Indiana's a easy draw just going historically, but I think that ought to be a tough game. And so, I think Penn State, Texas, those two look like they have the easiest draws in the first and second rounds, potentially, if they can get through there. But, it'll be easier said than done because I think SMU showed they're plenty feisty this weekend. And maybe Clemson's got a little something going on. Texas is a really good team, but they have their own flaws. And you never know when Quinn Ewers is going to throw that pick that flips the momentum in a game and, opens things up. But, yeah, you definitely want to take Penn State or Texas draw. Probably Penn State's just based on how most people view these names. SMU, Boise State compared to any other combination, I think 99% of just any college football fan off the street would be like, yeah, give me that path right there.
I tell you what, that game, Arizona State against either Clemson or Texas, they'll have a huge crowd at that stadium with Arizona State's fan base frothing at the mouth to get to where they are, and now more in tune than they have been in almost 20 years since the Jake Plummer team in 1996.
Well, and that's a team that I saw some pictures from AT&T Stadium, and I don't know what it ended up like at the end of it, but that was a team that didn't travel and fill out AT&T Stadium. So now you're potentially asking them to go 2 or 3 more road trips. And yeah, Texas might do that just fine. Guess what? They've got 5 million fans, if not more than that. But SMU doesn't. Boise State doesn't. Arizona State doesn't. Some of those schools are not like those other schools where, yeah, Georgia fans are going to travel 3 times and not have a problem with it, to Mike's point. But I think for a lot of programs, and even for some people in those programs, that's double the travel potentially of what you typically get in the postseason on top of the regular season that you've already been doing. So I'm sure some people have planned accordingly. Maybe they didn't go to the big regular season game because they saved up for the potential semifinal matchup. But to think that that's nothing travel-wise, I think that's just kind of foolish and dumb as well.
All right, so there you go. After all of these weeks, ever really since the anticipation that there would be a 12-team playoff, Alabama wants to argue. Maybe BYU would have an argument. And we'll get to some of those scenarios because we can't just do it all at once. And we'll get to pieces of what we're talking about in a minute. Who got Florida State?
Nobody.
I didn't think anybody did. I don't think anybody did. I know that there's arguments, and that's another part of the conversation. We'll get to the narratives or, yeah, but all that. We'll get to that. But I wondered, I didn't think anyone, there was this massive clutch of your pearls about anybody, Alabama or otherwise.
Well, there was when Carson Beck got hurt for a second. There was
my goodness, you're right.
There was a whole lot of, if they lose this game, they ought to be out of the playoff because their quarterback's injured. That was where the Florida State angle came from. But Carson Beck is, best we know, okay enough to go hand the ball off on the final play. But certainly that arm didn't look great. But, yeah, that would have been the big Florida State, fork in the road for the college football playoff committee potentially.
Clint Moses, Colorado got how?
They didn't win a conference title game. They lost 3 games this year. Their quarterback is healthy.
Well, it sounded like Alabama then.
Double birds to you on that one, Clint. I mean, honestly, look, here's the argument. 13-0, 1 injury. That's the argument.
Yeah.
Who got that?
That's the standard of getting FSU.
That's the standard.
Yeah.
13-0, conference title, 1 injury.
I shouldn't have brought it up. Now, Sir blah, 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 MC Gusto, maybe, but BYU losing to Kansas, of course, was a killer, when they lost that home game that kept them out of it. But their analytics and data, pretty strong, but it just seemed like they weren't even in that conversation. It was Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, or somebody else. How about, of all those teams, who's the most hot other than Oregon? How about no one is undefeated except Oregon? Nobody. We always say, what if 5 teams end up undefeated? Oregon is the only one in college football still left unbeaten, and they had to push away in that game against Penn State, but they did with just too many weapons for the Nittany Lions.
I guess the hottest team would be the one that's only lost since they lost to Oregon. That'd be Boise State. I mean, if you're talking about just win streaks, they'd be right there in that conversation. But I think old Sparky's pretty hot right now. I think the Sun Devils are in a nice little groove, and I know they're probably not going to get a lot of the respect nationally just because they're more of an unknown. Although I did see the old game day crew kind of walking back Desmond's comments from a few weeks ago. Did you guys notice that? Desmond went and studied up on Arizona State, and he's totally changed his mind now. Now he knows they're deserving of it. So that was interesting to see them kind of pivot from that a couple of weeks ago where they were just super disrespectful towards the Big 12 and the game they were discussing there. But, yeah, now Arizona State's worth talking about, and they gave them a little bit of love, so that was good. But, yes, interesting to see that. So, yeah, I think Sparky's in that conversation as well. But Oregon being the only undefeated, I don't know that I would have predicted that. I don't know that I would have thought there'd only be one unbeaten in this field, but that's the way that it worked out.
I thought there might actually be 3, not many more ever than that, because of the fact that not everybody plays everybody in a conference. Eventually, you do have a conference championship game, which in case you didn't play during the regular season. Armstrong Sims said he agrees about the conference championship games mattering. Otherwise, the SEC championship game wouldn't have mattered at all, although I never thought that either one of those teams, if they lost, were going to be out of it. What about where was it? There was one more comment. How about reseeding after the first round?
I don't know.
Just a question.
Yeah. It wouldn't do it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can understand where you'd come from with that. I don't love that idea, though. That, to me, gets a little bit too complicated. Even though it's not super complicated, I understand that. But
how could you reseed anyway? Because the 4 teams that get the first-round bye are still going to be higher seeded than you, unless it's who you play, right?
Yeah, See, you're asking me questions. I'm not good at on the fly just thinking about the way that all that works.
Like Clemson, if they win, would play Oregon.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I kind of like this better. It's just a little bit more clear and straightforward. But I get the idea there, and I'm wondering if maybe that's something they've kicked around before. If that's not something they kick around in the future, I think the one thing we do know for sure is all bets are off on this being like the concrete way that it's always going to be. I think 16 feels like an inevitability, and I think partially for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, where teams that are getting buys, like, hey, great, we play one less game, but it'd be really cool to host a playoff game between the hedges. So let's play that extra game. Now, how will that happen? More money from the TV networks. That's how that will happen. So if they want a 16-team playoff and everybody gets an opportunity at that first-round home game, then I think that's up there for discussion. I think the auto buys is going to remain or the automatic burst is going to remain a topic of discussion, so long as Sankey and Petiti are dipping their fingers in the pot and kind of controlling things.
Hey, Petiti hadn't said a word. This worked out great for him.
Yeah, it did. He's been quiet. But yeah, so my point being, I think they're going to continue to kick around ideas like more teams, changing up the format a little bit for home sites, things like that. And so, yeah, maybe reseeding after the first round. But I think that, for me, just at least for this year, gets a little bit too complicated, even though it's probably more straightforward than I'm thinking.
Yeah, Desmond Howard all of a sudden got educated on certain teams that also are part of the country and also a part of college football. And Scattaboo was huge, and more on him and the kind of game that he had. We'll get to that at some point. All right, we got to get to a lot more. We will have Ari Temkin at 3:40, so we have 10 minutes for this one. Conference championship games. Let's touch on that. We have a lot of coaching news. Which one do you want to go to first?
We got coaching. Do we have coaching later? No. Let's. I think we've kind of dove into the games.
All right. Let's go into the coaching news. Mike Gundy. Did he blink?
Somebody did. I don't know. This is not a situation that's going to end well. I don't think you just have these. I mean, and this is just me. I don't know any of the inner workings of Oklahoma State and Mike Gundy and their relationship and all that. But I just know that from doing this job for a long time, anytime you have a very public spat and then you can see people, okay, well, if one side's going to feed Pete Nakos, then I'm going to feed Pete Thamel and I'm going to do this. And you saw these kind of things coming out that were, like the fire. Craig and I talked about it at length on Friday. A lot of it didn't make sense. Like if he doesn't agree, they're going to fire him for cause. Well, if you've got cause to fire him, you should fire a guy, especially in the modern landscape of college athletics. There's 2 reasons you fire someone. They don't win enough, or they did something bad. That's why. So if they did something bad, you should fire them. You shouldn't do that. So I think that was one of those subterfuge kind of things that was going on there.
All right.
It just doesn't seem to me like it's going to end well.
Craig, Mike Gundy also hired a defensive coordinator, and Todd Grantham will have a note up there. You go as the new defensive coordinator, who's been at other places like Florida, Georgia, New Orleans this past season.
Yeah, I think Todd Grantham's a nice hire, so I like that one for Oklahoma State. I think that's a good step forward. As far as the just head coaching position itself there with Mike Gundy, that was really weird on Friday. It felt like you were in the middle of a breakup, and they had both taken to Facebook or Twitter or to whatever, TikTok, and were airing their grievances simultaneously to be the first out there to paint the other as the bad guy. and then going back and forth throwing insults, like that's kind of what it was, or talking bad about the other side. So that was all strange to see play out. You heard about that 5 o'clock deadline. Obviously, that turned out to be nothing. I'm not sure what went on behind the scenes, but I don't think we've heard the last of there being problems behind the scenes potentially, because that was just so kind of toxic publicly that it feels like that's not just going to completely go away because they've suddenly agreed that he's going to come back for another year. So I think you keep your eyes on that situation, but I'm glad they worked it out. I think it's best for both parties. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how they move forward. But I really like the hire he made with Grantham there as DC.
We don't have to have a full discussion on each of these coaching updates, but there are some more. Kansas has hired D.K. McDonald, his new defensive coordinator, has worked with the Eagles, but also has been their co-defensive coordinator and cornerbacks coach this past season. So Lance Leipold has changed up his staff a little bit. One coach left, retired, and now you, of course, have what's going to be with D.K. McDonald as defensive coordinator.
Yeah, quite often that Lance Leipold promotes from within. I mean, going outside for the offensive coordinator hire was a bit of a change-up he threw last year.
Tulane, John Sumrall, a very popular name. Paul, in fact, you and Craig have mentioned him. He's staying at least at now. Craig at Tulane. This is a nice win for now for the Green Wave at Tulane.
Yeah, I mean, he's a really good coach. A lot of rumors about him potentially making another jump this offseason, but he did a really nice job there in Tulane. Not the conference championship performance that they would have liked to have had, obviously. It was interesting to see Darian Mensah, his very talented quarterbacks, into the portal, so that'll be interesting to see where he lands and what kind of attention he gets. But I think John Sumrall is a coach that we're going to be hearing a lot about in the years to come. But for right now, that's a good win for the Green Wave to just keep it going and continue trying to build that program.
A couple of Big 12. Go ahead.
I got a breaking news on the playoff from Georgia. Says Georgia quarterback Carson Beck suffered an elbow injury during Saturday's SEC championship game. He and his family are exploring treatment options, and there is no current timetable for his return. Punter Brett Thorson sustained a knee injury to his non-kicking leg. He'll require season-ending surgery, and Kirby Smart had a quote about them attacking their rehab, and they'll be there to support them every step of the way. So obviously the punter, Brett Thorson's gone for the entire rest of the year, but that does not sound promising on Carson Beck with no name timetable.
The kid Stockton came in and gave him a lift, an emotional lift, if anything, a couple of runs, a couple of throws, and they were able to gut that game out. But I thought if you lost your starting quarterback and you dropped a little bit, Paul, I don't even want you to respond to this, that it should affect if you're a part of course, 12 teams.
They didn't have this news yesterday. Yeah. They only had it today.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
they had it. They probably had it, and I'm not arguing against Georgia here. They were.
No, you're just trolling Paul, really.
No, look, hey, I get it. If you're Georgia, you don't want to release this information. You don't know what's going to happen.
Hey, yeah,
you don't
Where
know.
would they have been though? They were in.
Nothing would have happened.
They weren't going to get knocked out regardless.
Yeah,
because their team wasn't really based around their quarterback. I think that's the big difference. Is Jordan Travis made a lot happen for FSU. Carson Beck wasn't the driving engine of the
Yeah, he
the
really
Georgia
had a very
disappointing.
I thought he had an average season, not disappointing, but I agree with you. All right, so there's that with Carson Beck and Stockton, and now people have film on him, and that could also help it up.
The backup quarterback led him 16 points in both games, but
All right, now 16 points. Let's go back to Kalani Sitake and also Kyle Whittingham. Notes within the Big 12. Good news for Kalani Sitake. After hot seat, Dave Aranda survived. Hot seat, Neil Brown didn't. Hot seat, Kalani Sitake did. He got an extension, and good for BYU and one of our favorite people on earth.
Yeah, and to be clear, his hot seat was more like maybe a year or two ago or something along those lines. Not this year, not with the way that they played. And I don't know how much there was even really heat anyways. You just heard grumblings on social media last year when they had kind of a rude awakening just with the way the second half of the season went for them and that slide, missing out on a bowl game. You heard grumblings there, but nothing more than that. And obviously he shut all that up this year. We're huge fans of his and glad to see him getting rewarded after a really great year that you wish could have been a little bit better. Just like a one more win or one less loss, I guess, would be the way. And maybe you're in the playoff, but you've got high hopes for everything moving forward for certain. A lot of momentum and a belief that you can win this league and that you were close to doing that this year. So glad to see him getting rewarded, and he's going to be around for a long time in Provo.
All right, let's go to Whittingham, this is not a surprise, but it wasn't a given. Kyle Whittingham is coming back for another year. I didn't think that he would want to end it on that kind of note.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to go out like that either. I think that's not surprising to me. The next story we're going to talk about in the Big 12 is way more surprising to me. But yeah, I thought he might want to go out one more on a high note. See if they can get a quarterback in the portal. Isaac Wilson's leaving. They've got Brendan Rose leaving. They've got a lot of work to do to build the roster. So, but I think one more ride, not too bad for Kyle Whittingham.
It was interesting to see some of the Utah reaction just from their fans when he posted the Michael Jordan-esque "I'm back" letter type of graphic. A lot of people excited about that. A few people not so excited about that. But it's kind of interesting to see that.
Morgan Scalley might be one of them.
Yeah, Morgan Scalley probably one of those not that happy to see that actually. But yeah, I mean, I think you kind of got the clue when they go and hire an OC last week. And I remember bringing up like, okay, so is Kyle Whittingham making this decision or is Morgan Scalley making this decision? Because if Kyle Whittingham's making this decision, he's probably back next year. So I guess he was making that decision on OC there, and it will remain his program, and we'll see what they can do to turn it around in year 2 of the Big 12. Obviously, won't be hard to surpass this year because it was such a disappointment. Would not have been surprised to see him right off into the sunset, but also not surprised to see him not want to end it that way either, and to come back and try to put a better product out there. So, yeah, a little bit of good and bad as far as the reaction goes, but I think probably mostly Utah fans are excited to see him try to bring this thing back and do so without the Cam Rising story lingering over their heads an entire offseason.
Well, he's going to play 12 years for somebody eventually, and I'm not taking a shot at Cam. It's a bad story with all the injuries. And then this also, the Big 12 with Gus Malzahn at Florida State. Hello, Scott Frost, who led them to the undefeated team before he went to Nebraska and flamed out, back in Orlando. Scott Frost, that didn't take long. UCF has their guy. Maybe he's matured a little bit, maybe grown up a little bit based on listening to him. It seems like he has. I don't think he just forgot football. He had some things that probably just needed to get better in a lot of different ways, and now he's back with the Golden Knights.
Well, he and his family, were very
Oh, my God, I said it.
Happy in Orlando.
I haven't said the Knights. I said the Knights. I haven't said them in a long time. I meant to say Knights.
But, and he had a nice little quote of like somebody sometimes should tell you when you're climbing the ladder that you should get off where you're happy, or something like that. I don't know if that's the exact quote, but it was a really good point. I'm curious to see how this goes. I thought this would have been an interesting job for a lot of different guys, but he won big there, and the high school coaches and the high school recruiting there hasn't changed that much. I think what happened in Nebraska shouldn't have much bearing on what's going on at UCF because it's two totally different situations.